Stay up to date on the latest political news this election season for less. Visit inforum.news/port and get 3 months of unlimited access to our news network for only 99 cents a month. Subscribe now at inforum.news/port. This podcast is brought to you by the North Dakota Petroleum Foundation. From heating our homes and powering our vehicles to cell phones, clothing, and medical equipment, oil and natural gas makes everyday life better. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas, advancing the possibilities. Learn more at ndpetroleumfoundation.org. Forum Communications Company is proud to be a part of the Trust Project. Learn more at thetrustproject.org. Welcome to Plain Talk. And listen, childcare obviously is a hugely important topic. As we come out of the pandemic, it was important before the pandemic. I think the pandemic has put, in the way it's changed how we work and everything else, it's put, I don't know what to say, more of a spotlight on it. It's really hard to get childcare. It's expensive, depending on which community you live in. It's hard to find. I went through it. I have young children. It's tough. And the thing I don't understand, and this will be my first question, because we just had the Chamber of Commerce just had an event in Fargo where they were talking about this issue, and the thing that I'm not understanding, and I want to talk about it because one of the people who've been working on this for the Burgum administration is Lieutenant Governor Brent Sanford. He's my guest. Of course, joining me also is Chad Oban, who co-hosts with me on Wednesdays. One of the things that I struggle to understand about this issue, fellas, and Brent, maybe I'll address this to you first, is what is the breakdown in the marketplace, right? Because I'm looking at this, obviously it's a very emotional issue. It has to do with our children. It has to do with enabling people to go out and live their lives and do work and be productive citizens, especially women. But, I mean, dads are hit by this too, but it's a tough issue. What is the breakdown that is preventing the marketplace from providing this service? Because there's a huge amount of demand. Just about everybody's got kids, right? There's a huge amount of demand for it. It's really expensive. Why can't we provide this service in a way that's accessible and affordable? To me, I'm looking at this, there's a breakdown in the market someplace. I don't know what it is. Maybe you can answer that question for me.
Good question, Rob. And you and I usually come at these things from the same point of, okay, shouldn't there be a free market solution to this? And what does government need to do to get out of the way or put our thumb on a scale in some portion of it, just a thumb on the scale for a small investment to make the whole system work? And the economics don't work for this as a business model, and it's because of the ratios. So let's get right to the economics of it. And I'm not saying these ratios are wrong. So when people listen to me, believe me, I've been with daycare for a long time. That was our number 2 thing in Wofford City to get people to move there. Number 1 was the hospital was old and sized for 1,500 people, so that had to be upsized, and that took the longest amount of time. Thank you to rural development for having that loan that we could able to tap later on and get that towards the end. But the daycare was limiting new families from coming into Wofford City, period. And the first solution was young gal, Tessa Moberg, comes home from Minot State with early childhood degree, wants to set up a daycare. Her banker realized she can't pay for a building. She can barely pay for the salaries and the food and the expenses you need with what you can get for revenue, and then maybe pay herself. So he found her an apartment building, talked to one of his oil field buddies is selling her an apartment building where she could use the top floor to have rent coming in to help subsidize the entire building mortgage. And then by the end, she wasn't even paying herself a salary. It was just paying herself rent and enough to cover the building. And so she came to us crying, and as leaders and economic developers saying, I'm done. I can't run this business, and I'm not helping anyone. We're tapped out at 60 kids. I'm not making any money. New families come to town. There's not enough daycare. I don't know what the town's going to do. And so I said, hold on. We need to have you engaged with the community and provide a bigger center. And so the city administrator, Kurt Moen, then we brought in Gene Beater, economic development, Steve Holen from the school, and Gene was also representing the county. And so we had school, county, city attorney put this together, what's now called Wolf Pup Daycare, and that's a community-owned daycare. And so when you don't have a YMCA in your city, like, only the biggest have YMCAs, they're generally are not centers that are being run. So we had to put this together from scratch. The city borrowed the money and paid for the building and built a brand new $3 million plus building. And Wolf Pup Daycare could never put any money towards occupancy. They barely could cover salaries. And so then we get into that fact. Well, why don't the economics work? And Tessa would argue with me. I'd say, shouldn't we push on human services to increase the ratio? She said, Brent, do you want your infant in here and have 4 infants for one 15-year-old that I can afford to pay the wage that I'm offering with 4 infants? If you were at home, would you have 3 other infants with you and your infant at home? No, she said, I usually go 1 to 2 on infants, lower than the ratio allows. And then you go up to, it's like 1 to 20 for 4-year-olds. And so you can, if you do the math, Rob, it's about $5 an hour for daycare at Wolf Pup Daycare. $5 an hour. If you're only doing 2 babies, it's a money losing proposition to do the kids under 3. And the ratios, if you get into conversation with daycare providers, most of them say don't mess with the ratios. Some say we could tweak a little bit because once they're potty trained, they're easier to handle. Once they can play with other kids, then maybe we could have some shifting, but that's not the answer. The overall answer is none of us that have children that have had children in daycare would say, I think you should have allowed more kids in there and have less workers. So it's kind of like what you face in the nursing homes. The economics don't work with what the service is, with what you have to pay an employee, and it's great. We can pay employees a little more these days, but they're not $7 an hour. The minimum would be 14 to 15 to hire employees in this situation. So the math does not work with the ratios allowed. So it's a business that frankly, and I have a couple legislators that argue with me and say we should be able to make money at this. Yes, in the larger community where you can choose and you can say no more babies and we're going to take all the 4-year-olds we can, you can cherry pick and do the math. At 20 kids, 20 to 1, 20 times 5 is $100, and you can pay your worker $25 an hour plus benefits if you had all 4-year-olds. And so that's not reality. Families come in, and how a daycare usually works is family comes in, 1, 2, 3 kids, we're going to take their baby as well, even if we have, the ratio is poor. So the economics don't work. And you'd have to charge upwards of $8 to $12 an hour for it to work for the business model. Now you go to the family side. Tessa Morberg was charging like $3.50 an hour when she was at Wiggles and Giggles, and then we had to go to the center concept, and we went to $4.90, and it was a complete outcry. We're not going to be able to afford this. So then you look in some other communities, and it's $7 an hour, and so that they've fluctuated at just barely over $5 an hour. But if you have 2 kids, 3 kids, all of a sudden it doesn't pay. And so here we are today with all these hard to hire positions. We're not talking minimum wage positions that are hard to hire. It's $20 an hour. It's $25 an hour. It's $40,000 a year salaries, $50,000. A family of 2 both making that kind of pay can't afford the daycare after 2 kids, 3 kids, they're done. That happened in my house. First child, home daycare, part-time, Sandy cut down hours. Second child, she cut down a lot more hours. Go to Watford City, found Wiggles and Giggles. Nick was able to be in there, not making as much. If you have 2 kids, finally Sydney went to school, that helps. Then third child, Aaron born, done. And that's with most families, it seems like, is the third kid, then one spouse stays home. And it's both spouses. There's got a very professional gal that I know that her husband stayed home once they hit number 3. And so this is a workforce challenge, Rob. And what we're trying to do in our study group is say, with our voters, with our legislature, fact of the matter is, if you don't think we should be putting money into 0 to 5, this exacerbates our workforce challenge. And so very trained, very managerial type employees, experienced employees are on the sidelines. And what is that number? So we're trying to engage EDND, GNDC, all the different economic development groups and employer groups of saying, how big of an issue is this for you? Are there 10,000, 20,000 people on the sidelines that are trained employees that would otherwise be coming to work if there was some help for that? And that's the first issue, is affordability, and so it's the daycare model is uneconomic. Then it's a lack of affordability. And then the third thing is is that the facilities are very expensive to construct. And so then the Bank of North Dakota, Todd Steinwand's been on our group, and he keeps bringing up, we'd still need to have low interest loans and grant programs for constructing facilities. So, Rob, this is one of the more complicated quagmires of government. And Chris Jones likes to bring this fact up. We spend $10,100 per student in K-12, but as Chad, as you probably have figured out and know, if you're watching education, if a school's in a declining enrollment and they get the guaranteed minimum, they're getting more than $10,000 per kid. So some schools are getting over $20,000 per student, which the governor brought that up to the NDSU incoming president, and he couldn't believe it. Think what higher ed could do with $20,000 per student every year. That's more than what it costs. And so we're investing that in K-12. What are we investing in 0 to 5? And so Chris brings that point up. Or should we be shifting between, we invest quite a bit for the higher ed too, 6,000-7,000 per, 10 to 20,000 for if you're 5 to 18, 0 if it's age 0 to 5. Should there be some movement within this from government investment? Is that part of an option? We don't know. That employers are saying they might do a little bit of a match, but then it's still a system that the economics don't work. And I don't think anybody in North Dakota thinks we should do a 0 to 5 K-12 type system where it's
public daycares, basically.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so trying to help this private sector that has a really bad economic model is a conundrum, but we're going to come with, our administration is going to come with an example of what we think might work. And it's probably going to be from a legacy stream. So, a proposal from legacy earnings of, if this is a workforce, if this is like number one for workforce of keeping those trained employees and having the younger families desiring to move here, then we're going to have a pretty good proposal, but it's going to be different than what you usually see coming out of our administration. It's not going to be what's the next industry. It's going to be, this is what we have to do to retain and recruit. And this might be the number one issue, but I tell you what, we need to have employers and economic developers saying, yes, this is our number one sticking point. Not what they usually say, bring more people to our state. Well, we know it's hard to bring new families here. We also know it's hard to retain all of our college graduates, but here we have people on the sidelines that are trained up, already had employers, already had management positions, experienced positions, that maybe they would go back into the workforce if there was a chance.
Brent, Rob, before we started, said, I'm not sure we're going to be able to talk about childcare for an hour. I hope you're planning on staying a little bit past 30 minutes, because I've probably got another 30 minutes just by myself here. So yeah. I think what you're talking about is really, really important. I will tell you, my 5-year-old son goes to the Y. In Bismarck, we pay $1,000 a month for one kid. His teachers are incredible. Miss Carly, Miss Sydney, they're changing his life. And it's not just because they're teaching him things, but they love him. And I think about the average wage of those people is $11 in this state.
I was just to put an exclamation point at the end of that. My daughter, who is 14, currently works bussing tables at Kroll's Diner and makes $11 an hour.
And put a finer point, one of Evan's teachers left earlier this year to go and be a barista because she could make more money. Yeah. I worry when we frame this just about workforce. I understand workforce. Yeah. That leads us to getting into those ratio questions. It leads us to getting into those square footage, in the sort of warehousing things. As a parent, I would encourage every legislator to walk into my son's class at 4:30 when their ratios are already maxed out and tell me if you think there should be more kids in that classroom, because it doesn't work. Uh-huh. And so I worry when we just talk about this from a workforce issue, we're ignoring the fact that, somebody yesterday at the chamber thing pointed out that childcare is subsidized heavily in North Dakota right now. It's subsidized by young women getting paid poverty wages to make it work. And that's true. There absolutely has to be a government role in this. But we also know that 85% of a kid's brain now develops between 0 and 5. So this can't just be about workforce. This has to be about those kids going into kindergarten with the skills that allow them to be good students, making teachers' jobs easier.
It's future workforce, Chad.
Yep. Well,
it's future workforce and not when you visit the pen, it's one of the amazing things from visiting the North Dakota Penitentiary to me was was there was a school in the middle of it. And they said a lot of the folks that are in here, a lot of the men in here, they didn't get to the second grade reading levels. And so they're getting GEDs or learning how to read. And so it just struck me. It's just like, wow, is this what we're resigning people to if they don't hit those marks by second grade in math and reading? And so it's so critical. And I encourage Kirsten Baszler and Chris Jones, bring those up, but don't stay on those topics, because our legislature then starts to glaze over, and then it gets into this, we don't want to back up the school bus to the maternity ward. And so that's why this topic was pulled out of DPI, moved into human services. The early childhood services in DHS now are operating this topic and put the best in class program together that Representative Robin Weiss visited down south in Alabama, I believe. And I mean, so we're moving forward with human services operating these programs, but I agree with you. I mean, it is paramount that, I mean, so much development happens by age 2. And so this can happen if parents are engaged at home, but then if parents are on the phone, then the lights are off on the little one's brain too. You know, if parents are not on the phone and engaging and learning, and then the learning activity in the brain is going strong, you know.
And to me, it is a conservative position to go upstream and invest early, so we don't have to invest on the back end in incarceration and other welfare programs.
That's what we're looking at. This is an investment. This is an investment. It's another way to invest.
I'm still, because to me, whenever we're trying to solve a problem, I like to think, what are the roots of the problem? Like, how did we get here, right? Because if you can address the roots of the problem, then you address the problem. So I'm wondering, like, I went to daycare in the 80s in Alaska. Kids are not a new thing. We've always had children in our society. What changed? What changed that we can't meet this need today when we did in the past? Maybe we weren't meeting it all that well in the past. Maybe that's the answer. I don't know, but it just, like,
we had babysitters in Wofford City. There were, even when I moved home in 2005, there were 2 babysitters that took up to 10 kids, and I don't know if they were licensed or what it was, but you know, I mean, that was what the options were.
Do you think that's babysitters? It's interesting. A while ago, I read this article in the Atlantic, and it was about this study they had done in England, and they went and they tracked where kids went after school, right? And they tracked, like, how far they would range from home. And, like, back in the 50s and 60s, these kids would be miles away from homes, running through rivers and forests and doing all sorts of stuff. And by the time you got up in the modern era, it's like straight home from school and not let out of the yard.
Yeah.
Is some of this the way our parenting has? Because I know you guys are, and I don't want like childcare factories where kids are, you know, put in, I don't know, little cages or something. I don't want that either. But I feel like a lot of our expectations for our children have changed, and sometimes not always in good ways. I think sometimes in kind of the helicopter parenting thing. And I'm wondering, does that play into this? Are our expectations of what childcare should be so high the market can't meet them?
Well, I don't know if, I'm
asking you to I'm making the argument that we should want. I realize what I'm trying to say. I'm just trying to get through this of, like, why, because that to me is still the sticking point. Why can't we provide this much needed, very important service without extending the public school system to age 0?
Well, from the time period you mentioned, both spouses being in the workforce has increased.
That's true.
The necessity to have both spouses in the workforce is there today more than ever. But also and probably the pressure on wages from that is what has, you know, I would say these ratios were even built when you could have minimum wage employees, but who has minimum wage employees, you know? And so when there's greater desire for participation from both spouses in a situation, and having less folks, you know, also having less folks that are at home on subsistence type programs, and have the single mom and dad be able to be in the workforce and not at home taking care of kids, then there needs to be more place to go. And then that wage pressure to go from, if you could have daycares operating with folks willingly working for minimum wage, so say $7 or $8 an hour versus doubling that, all of a sudden these ratios aren't such a big problem. And so I don't know if part of it is the ratios are set up around that, but I can tell you, yeah, you go into a daycare, you don't You don't look at this and go, well, the problem here is you don't have enough kids per provider. That's not what you see.
Yeah.
Well,
So that's not going to help us today.
Brent, not to mention, we can't keep employees. And now you add 5 more kids into my kid's classroom. Those teachers aren't sticking around
for the
very
person
long.
making $11 an hour.
No,
and now it's
we
like,
want them to be similarly trained as the K-12 teachers, right? And so one thing we did for Tessa Moberg was, okay, you're fully trained. You could go teach in kindergarten and have a pension and be making a good salary. And here she's not even able to pay herself a salary to her own business because she wouldn't push the price up against those parents. And so then we hired her when the community stepped in for Wolf Pup, we put her at a salary rate of an elementary principal to be the director of Wolf Pup Daycare. And it's a 190 child daycare center. And now the city bought the old post office and added a 40 child preschool. And they're looking at building another center if the county will help with the structure. But she's she is operating like an elementary principal. How often does that happen in the daycare world? And her employees are not compensated as they would be if they were across the street. And so as we put in more regulations too from the state and say you have to have early childhood degrees, well, then all of a sudden you're not getting away with $11 or $14 an hour either. And all of a sudden you're competing with the teaching degree across the street. And so the economics even get to be more difficult.
Brent, do you see what you guys did in Watford City, where the local community, the local government basically stepped in and just helped make it happen? Is that a model you think could be replicated in other communities?
People ask me that from around the state, and then it gets back to the being angry at oil and gas communities because we have gross production tax distributions that roll through too, and not just the property tax. But what happened is private sector was pushing on this so hard that I went out to them too and called the bluff and said, then maybe you should put some money into this. And so we ended up with 2 oil companies and 2 non-oil companies putting in $500,000. So they started the project with $500K of private investment. And then the city didn't have the cash for building infrastructure. So the city borrowed the funds and built the building, but had a revenue stream to pay it from. And you don't generally have that in your general obligation bonding. So it's more of the YMCA with a nonprofit focus, and the center focus is better, but you can't have a YMCA in every community. So what we're seeing is how to have it be where the flex, kind of like what we're doing with career academies now. If there's going to be a different model for every community, is it employers? Is it K-12 school? Is it higher ed? Who's the main push behind what the career academy is? With daycare, it could be churches, it could be employers, it could be K-12, it could be a higher ed situation. Minot State has a great program for their early childhood.
My kid is in it. CLC.
Yeah. And so, but I want to tell you an interesting quick side note. So here's what happens with Challenge Grant. We're looking at Minot State puts a request in for endowment funds and a match of 50% for endowments for K-12 learners. Great. Now they put in a match we want to build out the childcare area because that's the internships that our students get. Most of us on the board thought, great, that's a good use for a match. We have a donor that wants to do this. A couple board members and then the legislators agreed, no, we're getting into childcare now. And so they nixed that Challenge Grant investment. So that's how touchy, and I shouldn't this is like not a partisan thing either. It can get to be an age-based thing. My kids stayed home. We were okay. But it was shot down at Challenge Grant and couldn't come back. And Karen Krebsbach tried her tail off. She said, you know what? This is internships. We would fund this if it was a lab for nurses, but we're not going to do this because it happens to be where daycare also occurs. But our early childhood learners at Minot State, the students, that's where their internships are. But that's how touchy everyone is for
Brent, I think you talking about the generational thing at the legislature is really important. I look up the makeup of the Senate that's coming in January. The only one I know that has school-age children right now is Jordan Kanianen, whose wife stays at home, and God bless her that she can do that. There is a generational thing that doesn't understand this issue. But before we're going through time really quickly, so I want to get to a couple points if I can. Brent, I'm going to take you back to the governor's state of the state on February 16th.
Right.
He had mentioned the $117 million in federal fund to support childcare sector in the state. At the Fargo Chamber event yesterday, they talked about how that is going to end at the end of this year, the federal subsidies. And so there's going to be a cliff for providers. And some of the providers suggested that's all going to be passed on to parents. What is the state doing to prepare for that cliff? Because Judy Lee kept saying, well, we've got a session in January. We've got a session in January. That's not going to help parents in January, February, March, April, May. Is there conversations going on at the state about how to deal with that fiscal cliff that's coming?
I'm assuming Human Services will be bringing that as part of their budget recommendations from early childhood. But that, yeah, that's a quieter number that really was just helping them through COVID. But the roundtables we've had, and Tessa from Wolf Pup is always my number one call on these things, and she said we needed that. Without that, we were in big trouble. You know,
right.
when you had questions about if we should be even sending our kids and taking kids, but they've been needing that as they've gotten up and running since because of work. We still don't know where the workers went, right? So the Great Resignation, we still don't know, but it's just a mystery. And I ask every employer that question: where'd your people go? So that short story of that is, it sounds like there will be a push to continue that from the Human Services budget. So what I was referring to would be another concept of, if there's an affordability issue to get people back to work, where does that come from? And so it might be one of our legacy stream suggestions too.
Right. Also, in the governor's state of the state, he mentioned in April, we're going to be launching a workforce retention initiative that will allow childcare providers to provide extra dollars to employees who do the work every day for caring for kids. Did that money go out? And are employees getting that money? Because I haven't heard of any people working in childcare facilities who are getting extra money since this was supposed to be rolled out. That
was supposed to be part of all the work done through Human Services to daycares and in part of that system. And I couldn't tell you if that's part of where that 100 and however much you just suggested to continue. I don't know if that's part of that or not, but that was all part of Chris's plan. And so, but I can tell you, I'm not seeing a bunch of hands being raised from the providers that, oh, that was great that we got this, but I'm sure that it's part of the receiving the funds, is that there's more training, there's more opportunity, there's more compensation, but it wouldn't be enough when your average is $11 an hour.
No, I agree 100%. And I think what in the discussions I had, it was almost going to be like a bonus type check to people who had worked. And I just haven't heard if they've actually been sent out or not. And the reason why I bring these things up is one of the things I heard at the Fargo Chamber event yesterday was urgency. That like people are like, we want to see action. We need the state and the feds. And that was the feds getting more involved was shot down because of inflation. We don't want any more money coming into the state. But one of the things I'm nervous about is that you talked about the legislature. I get that this is going to be problematic. But I also think that this is our one bite at the apple to do something significant, following up on the pre-K stuff that was done by Weiss and others last session.
Yeah. That had unintended consequences too. Almost the entirety of that program is in smaller declining enrollment schools. And if there's because of the facility problem. So say you're in a community where all of a sudden you don't have as many classrooms being utilized, there the K-12 can offer this program in a classroom, and they can bring another teacher back, and it works really well.
We can't do that in Minot because
none of it's in the west. If the little dots on the map, none of them are west of West River. So I mean, it's not in the larger communities because they don't have any space in the K-12. But it's a good start and it's a good program. But we need to figure out how do you get that into the private daycare solutions that we all have in the centers. How do we get that into there, not just the smaller K-12?
And I just keep going back to, unless we do something about wages, we're never going to solve this problem. If we're treating people like professionals and paying them like professionals, that takes care of that. But where does the money come from?
I think part of it's a perception problem where we're looking at childcare workers like babysitters, and it's more technical than that. I thought it was a really good analogy that we should treat them like nurses. Right, it's a skill. It is a valued
elementary teachers at least.
Right, it's a valued and needed profession, avocation. So you've mentioned a couple of times legacy streams. What would it look like doing something for this out of the legacy fund?
Well, you remember the conversation last session with House Bill 1380, I imagine, and it wasn't as much glitz as 1425, which you and I argue about all the time on in-state investment. But 1380 is the legacy earnings, which automatically are dumped into the general fund. And so I'm constantly preaching to legislators, 1425 in the corpus of that endowment is hard to go in and crack that. But 1380 is the earnings from legacy fund, and they have the ability to appropriate that as general fund, but they never do. And then they didn't last time. So 1380 ended up being carving up what we call earnings, and then maybe 30 million next time for Clean Sustainable Energy Authority, University Research, and LIFT. So it was Mike LaFleur and Ron Sorvog and Mike Nathy's programs, 30 million. Do you know how much earnings we distributed? $972 million straight into ending fund balance that's now carry forward balance rolling into beginning fund balance. And that is the opportunity. And it's 300 million at the lowest of the years because it's interest plus dividends plus realized gains is how you calculate how much that is. And so we're saying there actually needs to be a plan. Part of our angst from our citizens of not using legacy fund is they never hear of anything that the legacy earnings go towards that is investing for the future, right? And so, hey, Clean Sustainable Energy Authority has been great. I mean, the CO2 that we're going to be, man-made CO2 we're going to get rid of from ethanol and coal and oil and gas is incredible out of that. LIFT is the new tech companies. Great. University Research needs to cover all of this, but they need to have a better way of explaining to this legislature how that's an investment in our future economy and our future civilization, and they haven't failed to this point, frankly. So we're trying to help them. And the fourth thing would be, if we're going to do something for workforce, how about part of that stream be for this? And so,
I think this would be palpable too. I think that's one of the problem, the consternation with the legacy fund. We are, as you just described, we are doing a lot of great things. The problem is there's just not a lot of things that the average citizen can wrap their arms around. Right? It's not. I can't touch it. I can't see it. I'm reading press releases and headlines about it, but carbon cap. I mean, it's a little, as important as it is. I don't want to demean those things, but it's not immediately relevant to the average
for these projects. No, unless you're going to work at that.
Childcare bills sure as hell are, and maybe that's my last question is what I kind of feel like we're at, if we keep nibbling around the edges of this, we're not ever going to solve the problem. I feel like we're either going to do this or we're not, and it's got to kind of be bold. But I think politically, I mean, listen, we live in an environment right now where a lot of North Dakotans don't trust their teachers, right? We have that whole thing where we've watched what happens at the school boards. And now, I think you very colorfully put it, backing the school bus up to the maternity ward. I mean, you can't ignore the political environment that you'd be trying to do this in. So the idea of like if it comes off as extending K-12 to, out of the womb 12, that's gonna fail. I think as much as I'm open to the idea and I want to talk about it, but I don't know that North Dakota is gonna go for that. So what is something bold that would actually address this problem without inflaming? How do you thread that needle?
I think there's got to be capital injected into this. And one thing I have failed to point out here is that we've been part of the reason to engage the employers is think about how much you spend on training and re-recruitment and all of this. It's a lot. So then I asked questions to big employers, and a couple of them were superintendents of large districts and hospital administrators. So not just your blue, and then also blue collar that employs 90% males. And they all said, hey, I'd be willing to put some match into this. So would employers have something that makes sense? It's got to be easy, and it's got to be something that's kind of off to the side enough that it's not viewed as giving a benefit to one employee and not another. So it's going to take some skill of how to feather this together. But if employers step up and say, we're willing to put in some match, and legislators see that this is a good investment in workforce development, and then it's a facility issue, it's an employee issue, the daycare workers issue, and it's a provision of the service issue and an affordability. If all of that can come together, which there's not a lot of time by January of 23 to put this all together, but if we're all singing from the same hymnal, it sure helps. And I can see that this could be from left to right, and from young to old would see, okay, this makes sense. It does make sense, because even if you think it's a bad idea, you'd like to be able to go to the restaurant and be able to have servers working and be able to go to the hospital.
Like to be able to start a business and have a labor pool you can draw from.
Yeah.
My favorite quote at the chamber event yesterday, and Robin Nelson, who was the moderator, did a very nice job, but she quoted somebody who said, childcare is the business that allows businesses to do business.
Yeah.
And, I think that's really good. And I think, Rob, I don't even think people like me are advocating for sort of 0 to 5 public school.
And I wasn't intending to suggest that.
But I think that the key here is, how do we make it more affordable for parents? And how do we make it the staff treated more professionally and being more professional, right? I think that if the education my kid's getting at 4 and 5 before he's going to kindergarten is going to benefit him his whole life.
Yeah.
Those teachers, and they are teachers, and Brent, I agree wholeheartedly. Somebody who's teaching pre-K should be paid with the same benefits as a public school teacher. But the question still is, how do you do that? How do you pay for it?
Public school teachers are expensive. So, when you're already dealing with
not expensive enough, Port.
Well, that's a debate for another topic. But
your wife is a public school teacher.
She is.
And you're advocating you're overpaid right now, Rob?
That's not what I said. I just said they cost a lot of money, and we're already dealing with an affordability problem. And I do think the one thing coming out of this is I think we've got to think of childcare workers as something more than babysitters, right? They're not babysitters. They're not just a mom doing it part-time out of her house. I mean, people do that, and it's wonderful, and I'm not running those things down. But I think part of the solution here is we got to think about this. This is a vital part of our economy, right?
But they're not government workers, because we haven't turned 0 to 5 into a government school like we have with K through 12, and then in the public higher ed system. They're not government workers. So where are those levers? We can trickle down and put more money into the system so that the parents can have better affordability. We can act as a workforce incentive and to get them back to work type deal, or allow them to stay at work. We can put better loan programs and grant programs into constructing these facilities, but we can't. What private employment area do we say, but you have to pay them $20 an hour? So this is going to have to be where the competition of hiring. Hopefully, if there's more funding in the system from employer support, from possibly workforce incentive support, that would bring the wages up, because those whoever's operating that daycare, whether it's private setting or the Y or anybody else, is competing in the marketplace against all these other professions. So hopefully it brings the wages up, but can we prescribe that? I don't know.
There are other states that provide sort of funding for employees, like a subsidy to a childcare facility, that if a teacher reaches all those different skill sets, so it's high quality as well, there is a payment from the state that goes to that facility in order to pay their employees X amount of dollars. And one of the things that, Brent, I like that you said earlier, there's not going to be one solution for every community, right? Watford City has some private business that can put money in. There's a lot of communities where the biggest employer is the school. And do they have a bunch of extra money to put into childcare? I think that depends. That there needs to be some flexibility and figure out what's best for an individual community. But we can no longer go where, we have a member, a teacher down in South Central North Dakota, who drives 45 minutes each way to drop off her kid at childcare. That's not sustainable for a second grade teacher to be able to do that for very long. And so I think there are these deserts, but it's not, it's also an urban issue. We heard yesterday in Fargo, there's places with 700 family waiting lists to get into childcare.
I can tell you, as someone who has had to find childcare in Minot, which is a large community by North Dakota standards, it's expensive and it's hard to find. We were lucky. We got very lucky, and now Now Coop's in the CLC program, which is wonderful, which is another. And like most problems, there's not going to be one silver bullet. I think it's about enabling a lot of different types of solutions that are going to match the communities that they're being implemented in. Brent,
the Williston mayor just called me this morning on this topic. Ironically, I don't know if he saw that if you'd promoted that I'm going to be on here talking about this or what, but he called me this morning, and Mayor Klug, and just, hey, and I've left me a message. I'm going to call him after this, but he said just want to go through some daycare options, what we could do as a community, and so I think it was pretty unique what happened in Waterford City, but we did out of necessity. I mean, we obviously had the highest population growth of any county in that decade, and it all happened in 2 years. So what Steve Holen did at K through 12 had to happen at 0 through 5. When you go from 6 kids in an age group from when my daughter was born, who's 21 today, to 190 in my second graders class when we moved out of Waterford City, I mean, it was just an exponential challenge. And so our community had to do something. And in a crisis, I think there's a lot to be learned from it, though. I mean, how much do we put into park and rec? How much do we put into other priorities?
Well, that's the other thing. I mean, are there summer programs we could do to get the kids in a park, or doing something fun, doing like a space camp or something? I mean, I think there's lots of things you could do that would be childcare, but would also be like other fun activities, be it sports or science or computers or just playing. I think there's a lot of different ways.
And there are other interesting models. I mean, what's going on in coal country with the co-op out there. And again, that was just the communities coming together and saying, we've got to have this if we're going to survive. And so I think there's some creative things, and, we just have to figure out how to make those things sustainable. And Brent, I gotta applaud you for paying your director in Watford City like a principal. That's incredible. Yeah. That is incredible.
Otherwise, what incentive does she have from not just going, you know what, I could go across the street and I could be an experienced early childhood teacher with that, all of my experience, and make this with a pension. Why should I keep, putting up with this headache where I have to be basically a business manager? At times there are 400 kids using that 190 childcare center with the part-timers and the preschools and all the rest. And so, Tess is a special case, but I mean, it's something where you have to recognize that talent. Otherwise you're not going to have the knowledge base that's required for what this is. It's a very complicated business with no excess of revenue and no way to get more. There's no way. Most businesses, there could be a good year and a bad year and a chance to just have shoot the moon one year. Not this one. This one is very much like a utility, or where you're just very locked in, and the only thing that's going to happen is a little downward trend, which you can't afford. So it's a challenge every day.
Yeah, the profit margin in child is like 3%, and most of these are tiny businesses. I mean, the 3% profit margin might work if you're enormous, right? If you're a giant like chain, but these aren't. Anyway, Brent, you promised us 30 minutes. We've now taken 42 minutes of your time, but I appreciate your passion on this. I appreciate you coming on and talking to us about
pleasure.
it.
Thank you. Thanks, Chad. Thanks, Rob. My pleasure. Anytime.
Well, that was a really good interview. The lieutenant governor, frankly, was very candid. Because I think some of the political challenges here are not small. When you look at the environment, unfortunately, this is the environment we have to make policy in, where people don't trust the government. There's a significant portion of the population that thinks the government's trying to take over everything and trying to indoctrinate everything. All the concern, like, oh, they're going to teach my kid to be transgender or something. That's the environment we're operating in, and then you're going to expand. Let's have government provided childcare. Boy, that's not what he was pitching. I shouldn't say that. That wasn't at all what he was pitching. But I'm afraid that's how some people are going to perceive it. And boy, that's going to be a problem.
Yeah, it is a very interesting thing. The policy on its own is very complicated, because you do have this thing where families can't afford to pay anymore. The business model doesn't work. Employees don't get paid enough to stick around. We talk about the average $11 an hour, but plus they also, by and large, don't get benefits. I mean, I think about Obamacare and people staying on their parents' health insurance until 26. that's probably saving a lot of young people working in childcare that they don't have to pay for their health care right now. But it is very complicated. And I agree. He was very candid on some of the political difficulties that they're going to experience moving forward. And I think it is generational. I mean, because I think you can make an argument for all across the political spectrum about why this is needed. I want to talk about the kids' brain, but there's a workforce piece. There's a conservative approach to investing when they're 0 to 5 rather than investing when they're in prison later on, go upstream, if you will. But it is just complicated.
And I think there's a role, and there's not one solution, so I'm not touting this as a single solution, but I think there's a role too in looking at some of the regulations. We talked a lot about ratios during the interview, and I'm not sure there's a lot of room to wiggle there, but what are some of like especially if you're getting like federal food dollars, what are the inspection things? What does the compliance look like with a lot of that stuff? I remember not so long ago too, there was a situation in Fargo where a daycare had a walk away. A kid, they were coming back from a walk or something, and a kid got off the property, and this daycare had an otherwise pristine record. They obviously had a very unfortunate incident, but they lost their license immediately. Do we need to be so draconian, right? And I realize that that's tough because we tend to take a maximalist approach when it comes to child safety, and I understand that. But on the other side, if we're so ticky-tacky and there's so much red tape, we're just contributing to the problem where this business model doesn't work.
And again, I think that it just is a business model that needs government subsidies to make it work. And so I think I think your point about we need to do it big rather than nibbling around the edges. I will tell you, I'm frustrated with some local chambers who've been talking about this issue for 10 years. Yeah. And haven't actually done anything.
Every time it's like everybody gets very super sincere and like, we're going to have a roundtable discussion about childcare. And then everybody says very, very sincere things or very serious things. They have a very serious conversation and then nothing happens.
Yeah, I mean, so, Brent referenced the governor's roundtables that they've had with some businesses, and I wish they would have gone out to communities so people who are actually providing childcare could participate, because they can't just leave on a Tuesday afternoon. But one of the things that I heard come out of that is, they all agreed that capacity is an issue. Well, we've known capacity has been an issue for a long time. What's the solution to capacity? And, you mentioned having kids, and there's a wait list. We were on a wait list. I talked to President Nick Archuleta from North Dakota United this morning. His kid just graduated from high school, and he said when they had Christian, there was a wait list back then. So I think that this issue is getting bigger and bigger, and we have to do something substantial, because if we don't do something substantial 2 years from now, and Rob, how do you get like young professionals to come to our state if there's not an option for childcare?
Yeah.
And it's a tough nut to crack, but something big has to be done.
I agree. What that big thing looks like. And listen, I get hives when we talk about the government just stepping in and doing this. I don't
want it to be 0 through 5 public schools.
Right. And it's not what I'm accusing you of. I'm just saying And part of the problem, too, is putting it on employers. Like, I think a big problem with the health insurance mess is that the primary customer for health insurance is your employer, right? Like, I'm not the customer for my health insurance plan. My employer negotiated. Reformed Communications negotiated with. And then I sign up when I employ them. But my insurance company is basically serving my employer, not me. Even though I'm paying a lot of it, but it's indirect. It gets withheld from my paycheck. My employer's paying part of it. They're the one that negotiated the deal. And I worry, too, if we put this on the backs of employers, you're going to get the sort of child care that meets the needs of employers and not necessarily families. There's right. Danger in going that route. I think there's danger in going where we're just going to open up government daycares. Well, now the daycares are going to serve the government and not necessarily the families.
But isn't this a place where we need to look at this as a society?
I think government needs to be a facilitator. And I think there's a way to do that, but leave it in the hands of families and choice. And that might mean You know, I mean, a lot of the problem, I mean, you look at when the government gets involved and we say, well, we can't do this kind of education and you can't read this book and you can't talk about this. Like, that's the problem when you bring it in. We may have to accept, right, what the lieutenant governor said. Part of the solution to this is churches. A lot of churches run daycares, right? So,
Sure.
so people on the left may need to get comfortable. And I say this, I'm not a Christian, I'm an atheist, but people on the left may need to get comfortable that some of this money is going to go to churches.
Listen, there's nothing that says that we have to provide a education through 0 through 5. So I think the conversation about government subsidies to childcare providers is different than private schools, for example, for K through 12. I think that we need to be talking about all the above options. And I think there is a place for government to help provide assistance to employees who are trying to make ends meet, who are professionals. But it goes back to treating these people like professionals. And that comes with wages. Yeah. That comes with, all those different things that go along with it. It comes
with the way we talk about it, right? And probably it's a product of what I do for a living, right? I do words for a living. But I think it's very important. Like, to me, that is the beginning. That is where the roots are, is how we talk about an issue. And if you want to change an issue, a lot of times you have to change the way we talk about it. We need to talk differently about childcare providers, because when we talk about it, and I'm guilty of this as well, we think of 15-year-old babysitters, right? We think of, some mom doing it out of her home, right? And again, not running those people down. They're doing great work. In fact, people like that have taken care of my children. I'm not denigrating them, but I don't think that model, the in-home daycare, while I can be part of it, it's not providing us what we need. We got to do more, and I think that's thinking about childcare workers as a real profession, like nurses, like teachers, like something like that.
And thinking about where we send our children is not. Somebody yesterday said we can't think of just children fitting into a slot, right? I mean, it's not just, hey, where am I gonna put my kid for the next 8 hours so I can earn a living? That's not a good strategy for the long run, right? I mean, just throwing a kid in a room and, here's a book, whatever. I don't know about you, but, there's been several times where Evan has come home from the Y and talking about something. Maybe it's the planets or something in space. And it's like, where did you learn that from? Because you ain't learning it from me. And it's what they learned about. Or there's nothing more amazing than walking into Evan's classroom and having one of his teachers standing in front of 18 kids or whatever and teaching them a lesson, and they're just like mesmerized and staring.
Yeah, they're having
up.
fun. Yeah.
Yeah. And I can't get him to focus on me, just one-on-one, as well as that teacher has the skill to get 20 kids to focus on her. And we need to treat them like professionals, or they're not going to stick around.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we could put childcare on par with teaching. I mean, I think that's where it needs to be. It's professional. It's important. It matters, right? Because I think everybody would, whatever all the diverse opinions we have about as a controversial education sometimes get, I think just about everybody, except for maybe some cretins on the very margins of society, agree that teachers are hugely important.
Yeah,
and I think we got to feel the same way about childcare workers.
And I appreciate all the conversations that are happening around childcare right now. I think there's a lot of different people at the table talking about this. But the one thing I would say is it needs to happen quickly. Because the problem isn't going away; it's probably getting worse. And so something has to happen quickly and substantially. And so I hope this task force that the governor's office is working on comes up with something. I hope
they put something bold on the table for the legislature, and understanding that's going to be a fight in the legislature, but you can't win it if you don't start it.
And we also know that something coming from the governor's office isn't really going to be well liked by this legislature. It sort of starts out with the problem.
At least part of it.
Yep.
So there's political dynamics at play here that aren't helpful. So that's going to be tough. I think some of the people are big enough to recognize that this is a problem, but I do really think, and I don't like some of the stuff like, old white man. Blah, blah, blah. I hate that stuff. I don't like it. I do think that there is a generational issue in how this issue is perceived, because I've seen it in my own family, right? I think off air, as we were saying goodbye to the lieutenant governor, I was talking about how weird my dad thought I was when I was working for him. He thought it was weird that I would want to take, paternity leave, and I was talking like a week off, right? I wasn't talking like months or weeks or whatever. I was like a week to help, the transition into a new baby into the home, and he thought that was super weird. When I was born, he went back to work the next day. Like, he came from his shift, he was there when I was born, and he went to work the next day. That was his generation. And I'm not saying, like, that was how things were then. I'm not trying to be critical. But it's different now. We don't live in a world where most families can make it on a single income. We just don't. We don't live in a world where it's easy to buy a house and it's easy to do a lot of the things that they were able to do. It's a different world now, and our policies need to reflect that.
Yeah, and I think, the one thing that our legislature often lacks is sort of different life experiences, different sort of stations in life, because of the way it's set up. I mean, it's with being part-time legislature, it's hard for people sort of in their earning years to be a state legislator.
The sort of people that could serve are retired or
young
or like independently wealthy. Right. Yep. And neither of whom are particularly going to understand the childcare issue. Because if you're independently wealthy, right, like, you don't need, somebody can stay home, or you can just afford to pay what you have to pay.
Yep.
So
afford an individual nanny, to take care of
something like that. I don't know where one spouse can stay home and they can make that work. I mean, whatever it is, but it's a tough issue. I am really hoping, and I'm ready to throw my rhetorical support, for what it's worth, behind an issue like that. But I do really worry that some of the other political shenanigans that have been going on are going to make this very, very hard.
Well, and I also think about the purpose of the legacy fund. I mean, the purpose of the legacy fund is sort of long-term investments in the betterment of the state.
Yeah.
Childcare fits that criteria. And I think your point about we can't really see the benefits.
Of a lot of the things
great
that we've
in the
been doing
newspaper
so far.
article, but I think this would be a big win for the legacy fund.
Politically, I think it's something that a lot of North Dakota voters could wrap their arms around. Right, it's a real palpable thing. Either they're going to benefit it from directly, or their children are going to benefit from it, or their grand or whatever. Like, they're going to see this is a real, tangible benefit that the citizens of North Dakota are getting from their legacy fund. And even though all the other things, carbon capture, those are tangible, those are benefits too, they're not as tangible. You can't.
Right. And it's so relatable for anybody probably under the age of 45. I'm 46, so I barely make it, or I don't make it, I suppose. But like the chamber event in Fargo yesterday, I was told it was their most heavily attended eggs and policy events that they've had since COVID. And so this is an issue that people are really interested in and really concerned about.
That was one of the things, when Jess was talking about going to school, one of the things that we struggled with was, how do we pay? Like, and even all the years before, we would talk about, like, well, because Jess stayed home in the early part of our relationship, right? And then it was later on we were talking about, well, we need to get another income coming into the house. But you had to balance that against what it would cost to have somebody watch the kiddo, because I couldn't do it. I'm working all day.
Yep.
So that's a reality that a lot of families face, and I think the state of North Dakota, we have the resources to do it, and I think we can get there in a practical way that's going to serve the need without turning into an expansion of the K-12 system. And again, not accusing that's what you want. I'm trying to allay fears of people who think that's the only solution we're talking about.
And I think finding a balance between warehousing kids and having sort of a 0 to 5 public school system, there's a middle ground there to make this work. And again, I think making the business model work in a way that allows employees to be paid well and as professionals is what we need to figure out. But I mean, who's starting a childcare facility right now with a 3% margin? And I mean, there is a need.
You're not nobody with a profit motive is doing it, right? And I say that profit motive makes the world go round, right? Yep. Profit motive is why we don't have to command farmers to farm. Right, nobody has to order people to make food available in the grocery store. It just happens because people need food, and you can turn a profit doing it. The problem is, and this was such a sticking point for me in trying to understand this issue, is why we can't make money. Why can't there be profit in an area that's such a need, such a pressing and widespread need. Why can't we make money doing this? And I'm still not sure I entirely understand that, and I still think that needs to be part of the conversation. How do we make these profitable?
But I heard yesterday, I mean, you're looking at startup costs at about $1 million for a facility, and then you start thinking about a 3% profit margin. It takes a long time to make up that $1 million.
But what is that $1 million? Are there some things we could get rid of? I don't know.
Facilities. I mean, it's, some of it's important.
Some of it is. I'm not saying I don't want to go full unregulated, right? I want the kids to be safe, but I do. I mean, again, I still remember when Fargo was trying to regulate the type of juice that daycare providers were providing. I mean, that made me angry because my anger at that was rooted in this issue. They're carrying enough burden. It's hard enough to be a daycare provider. Knock it off.
Well, and again, I mean, that's why we want to hire professionals in that kind. You talk about the kid walking away. I mean, you walk into a childcare facility. I don't know how that's not happening every day.
Listen. There's parents who have two kids where a kid walked, right? I've done that where you're trying to put the groceries in the car and the 6-year-old sneaks off, right? And it makes you so mad because he put himself in danger. But I mean, kids can be real son of a guns. I'll tell you what.
And don't get me wrong, if I'm the parent whose kid walked away, I probably want that facility shut down as well. But I can understand it happening.
I get it, but on the other hand, man, stuff happens sometimes. And one incident, I don't know, when it's such a pressing need. I mean, if there's a pattern of problems, that's a different thing. One, boy, I don't know. Well, Chad, I think we're at the end of our time. This is such a pressing issue. I have a feeling we're going to be talking about it more, especially after the first of the year when the legislature kicks in and we're going to see maybe some real plans on the table, I hope.
Yeah. Well, Rob, let me just, for all the legislators who are listening, I'm sure it's most of them, when Chad Oban and Rob Port agree that something is a pressing issue that needs big solutions, it's probably time for action.
Yeah. Well, although I'm a traitor to the cause, not to a lot of them. Well, some of them. I'm still very much a limited government conservative. I do not want to reinvent the wheel here, but I think there's some things we can do to help.
Right on.
A lot of different things. Chad, thanks for your time as always.
Thanks, Rob.
Did you know Forum Communications Company has a robust podcast library? At inforum.com/podcasts, we have everything from politics, sports, true crime, outdoor adventure, and more. Visit inforum.com/podcasts and explore them all today.